Long before swords were drawn or forts were seized, the shores of Sind echoed with the voices of merchants, mystics, and monarchs, all part of a vast Indian Ocean world. Today, we go back to one of the earliest Arabic sources on Islam's arrival in South Asia, Baladhuri's Futuh al-Buldan, to ask, was the story of conquest ever really so simple? Welcome to this deep dive. You've shared some really fascinating material with us, digging into the early history of Islam in South Asia, particularly around Sind and Gujarat. And it's a history that, well, today it's often framed through this lens of an 8th century conquest, almost like that's the starting point for later tensions.
That framing is definitely out there, yeah. And it does tend to, reduce something incredibly complex down to a pretty simple story. Invaders arrive, take over. End of story, almost.
But the source material we're digging into today, this analysis of a really foundational early Arabic text, it pushes back against that simple picture from the start.
Absolutely. We're diving into Baladhuri's Kitab Futuh al-Buldan, the Book of Conquest of Lands, essentially. Baladhuri, he was a historian writing in Baghdad, mid-9th century. So, we're already looking at an account written maybe 150, 200 years after the events he's describing in Sind.
Right. So there's already a gap.
There is. And our goal here is to really understand what this early source tells us, about the context, the actual events of these Muslim campaigns in Sind, and crucially, whether Baladhuri himself paints it as a simple, straightforward conquest.
Okay, let's unpack that, because the analysis you shared, it immediately challenges that whole idea that the 8th century campaigns were the first time people from Arabia had significant contact with the subcontinent.
Exactly. And what's really striking is just how connected Sind and Gujarat were to Arabia, Iran, Central Asia, long before Islam even. Long before distinct Muslim political groups existed in Arabia.
We're talking really deep connections.
Oh, yeah. Millennia. You've got evidence of Harappan Mesopotamian trade way back in the 4th millennium BCE.
Right.
Then, the Hellenistic Roman periods, the famous Rome-India trade route. People used to think that was just sort of luxury stuff.
Spices and silks.
Right. But research now shows it was bulk goods, too. Salt, sugar, timber, textiles, much more like regular integrated trade.
Which implies much deeper sort of everyday connections, not just elite goods.
Precisely. And then you layer on the Sasanian Empire, based in Persia. Big power. They controlled trade in the Persian Gulf, the Arabian Gulf, from the 4th century CE. And they had a presence, a real footprint, in ports like Siraf, Rishar, and even Daboul in Sind by the 5th century.
Daboul. Okay, that name's going to be important later, I feel.
It really is. And you get accounts from the 6th century, like Cosmas Indicopleastes talking about Sri Lanka Serendip. He describes it as this major hub connecting trade from Persia, China, Ethiopia, India. And he specifically mentions goods from Sind's spikenard, castor oil, things like that. And ports like Daboul are mentioned.
And we even have Chinese travelers mentioning this.
We do. Pilgrims like Faxian, Xuanzang in the 4th, 5th, 7th centuries. They traveled to India, wrote about Sind cities, its ports, its trade. Faxian noted merchants from all over the place in Serendip.
So it paints a picture of a really bustling, interconnected region.
Totally. And here's a key point from the source analysis. Arab communities themselves were already living in some of these ports in Sind and Gujarat Thana before Islam emerged as a political force in Arabia.
Really? Arab families?
Yeah, settled there for trade, sometimes even political exile from the peninsula. So, generations of interaction were already happening.
So when the 8th century campaigns happened, it wasn't Arabs arriving in a totally unfamiliar land. There were already established communities there.
That's right. So the encounter in the 8th century, it wasn't just a military thing appearing out of nowhere. It was also, in a way, a continuation of these existing Indian Ocean networks. And the analysis adds it was partly tangled up with the political fallout after the Sasanian Empire dissolved.
Okay, that really shifts the perspective. It's building on centuries of interaction, not starting from scratch. Now let's talk about Baladhuri himself, how he wrote this.
Yeah.
His book belongs to a specific genre, right?
It does. Kitab Futuh al-Buldan is part of the Futuh genre. Futuh literally means opening.
Opening, not conquest.
Well, it came to mean conquest, or be understood that way, but the word itself, opening, maybe hints at something broader, like opening up new territories to the expanding Muslim state.
And this genre, it pops up in the 9th century.
Yeah, it grows out of earlier seerah texts, biographies of Prophet Muhammad, which included his military campaigns. The Futuh genre kind of zooms out, covers the expansion after him.
And the source mentions these Futuh stories had a political job to do.
That's a really important point about how history gets written. Fred Donner's work, cited in the analysis, suggests these narratives were useful, particularly for the Umayyads, who were ruling this massive new empire.
How so?
By telling stories of successful campaigns, successful openings, it helped legitimize their rule, especially over all these non-Muslim populations they now governed. It reinforced their authority, maybe even a sense of destiny.
Right, recounting the expansion story validates the present power structure.
Exactly. And over time, these future texts got more formal. They started including things like isnad chains of who reported what to show reliability. And they often took on this, teleological view, seeing the expansion as part of God's plan, preordained.
But Baladhuri, he's writing later under the Abbasids in Baghdad, not the Umayyads.
Correct. He's an Abbasid court historian, and he relied heavily on earlier writers, especially someone called Madaini, for the sin section. So the analysis suggests we should see Baladhuri's work as maybe an act of imagining the past from an Abbasid perspective.
Meaning it might reflect Abbasid concerns or policies.
Potentially, yeah. Maybe their views on how to manage their own eastern frontiers, looking back at how the Umayyads handled things. It's history written with a present context in mind.
That's crucial context. It's an early source, yes, but filtered through a later time and political lens.
Definitely. And what's interesting in Baladhuri's account, even before we get to the famous Muhammad bin Qasim campaign in 712, is that he actually records earlier Muslim efforts in Sindh.
Oh, really? Before Qasim?
Yeah. Under the second caliph, Umar, around 636 CE, he mentions naval expeditions, maybe probes or small raids sent to ports like Thana, Broach, Dable.
Small-scale stuff.
Seems like it. Baladhuri actually says the governor who ordered them got a sharp telling off from Umar, which suggests maybe they were unofficial, unsanctioned little sorties.
Okay. And under the next caliph, Uthman.
Around the mid-7th century, another expedition. This one led to a report from a guy named Hakim bin Jabala, and Baladhuri quotes his description of Sindh. It's pretty bleak.
What did he say?
Things like, water supply sparse, the dales are inferior, and the robbers are bold. A small army would be lost there, and a large army would starve.
Ouch. Not exactly a glowing review for potential invaders.
Not at all. And Baladhuri notes this report put Caliph Uthman off sending more forces to Sindh for a while. Now, the analysis suggests Baladhuri including these, early failures or warnings might be significant for his Abbasid readers.
How so?
Maybe it provided a kind of historical precedent for later Abbasid policies that focused resources elsewhere, away from Sindh. Even back then, it was seen as difficult territory.
Interesting. Meanwhile, the Umayyads who came after Uthman, they were still dealing with issues on their big eastern frontier, places like Makra.
Right. Big, difficult frontier. And they were grappling with rebels groups like Karajites, Alois, who opposed the Umayyad state and used these remote areas as refuges. There's even a poet, Hamdani, quoted basically saying, Makran is useless, no profit in trade, no glory in battle, just hardship.
Sounds like a tough assignment.
Mm-hmm.
So when does the focus sharpen on Sindh, leading to the big campaign?
The source analysis points to the reign of Caliph Abd al-Malik, late 7th, early 8th century. And crucially, his appointment of this really powerful governor, Hajjaj bin Yusuf Thaqafi, over Iraq and the entire eastern frontier, all the way to Sindh.
Hajjaj, he's a major figure in this.
Absolutely. His job was basically to crush rebellions and push Umayyad control eastward.
And this is where the story of the captured women comes in.
Yeah.
The one often given as the reason for invading Sindh.
Yes, exactly. This is the story in Baladhuri that really takes off in later histories as the main casus belli, the reason for war.
How does Baladhuri tell it?
He says the king of Serendip, Sri Lanka, sent some Muslim women back to Hajjaj. They were apparently daughters of traders who had died there.
Okay.
But their ship gets captured off the coast of Dable by pirates, identified as the Mid people. And Baladhuri includes this really dramatic detail. One woman supposedly cried out, Ya Hajjaj, ah Hajjaj.
Like a cry for help across the ocean?
Exactly. And when Hajjaj hears about it, he apparently replies, Ya labaik, here I come, or I respond. Very theatrical.
Wow, that's memorable.
It is. So Baladhuri says Hajjaj writes to Raja Dahar, the ruler of Sindh, demanding the women back. Dahar apparently writes back saying, look, these pirates, I don't control them.
Plausible deniability, maybe?
Perhaps. So Hajjaj sends commanders Ubidullah, then Budale, but both are killed trying to deal with the situation.
Okay, so that does sound like a pretty solid reason to launch a bigger campaign. Piracy, captured women, killed envoys.
It does, and that's why it became such a potent story later on, right? This narrative of rescuing helpless Muslim women. But here's the really key insight from the analysis of Baladhuri. He places this whole incident about a decade before Muhammad bin Qasim's main campaign.
A decade. Not immediately before.
Not according to Baladhuri's chronology. He tells this story within the context of the ongoing efforts Hajjaj was already making on the Makran frontier, dealing with rebels and consolidating control.
Ah, okay. So in Baladhuri, it's maybe one significant event, but happening amidst existing military activity and strategic goals, not the sole spark that suddenly ignites everything.
That's what the analysis suggests. Its importance as the only reason probably gets amplified later. In Baladhuri, it's part of a bigger picture of frontier management, security, and state expansion.
That's a really important distinction. It wasn't just one pirate raid triggering it all, but part of a wider set of issues: frontier control, finances, rebels. Which brings us to Muhammad bin Qasim himself and the 712 campaign.
Right. So Muhammad bin Qasim, he's Hajjaj's nephew, very young. A poet, Baladhuri, quotes, calls him just 17. And he's from the Thaqi family, very influential under Hajjaj.
And Hajjaj seems to micromanage this expedition.
Absolutely. Baladhuri describes Qasim being sent from Iran with 6,000 troops plus others. And Hajjaj is sending detailed instructions, even logistical advice like how to deal with potential dysentery using vinegar-soaked cotton because vinegar was apparently scarce in Sind.
Sending medical advice, that's detailed.
Very hands-on. Baladhuri then describes the taking of Daybul. Qasim arrives on a Friday, sets up camp, trenches, flags, the whole military setup, and he uses this massive catapult, the Arus the Bride. Took 500 men to operate it.
Wow. And the temple there. That's often mentioned.
Yeah. Yes. Baladhuri describes a major temple, a bud, with a tall mast or pole topped by a big red flag visible across the city. He mentions a minaret and idols, sanam, too.
Yeah.
And Hajjaj, sending messages back and forth, specifically tells Qasim, target that mast with the catapult.
The mast, not the whole temple.
The mast, specifically. They break it. This causes panic or distress in the city. Fighting follows for 3 days. The governor flees, the temple custodian is killed, and Qasim takes the city. Baladhuri then says he marked out areas for Muslims to settle, built a mosque, and stationed 4,000 men there.
And the source analysis notes how later accounts, like the Chachnama, really pick up on these themes from Daybul: the letters, the temple, the settlement.
They definitely do. But here's something Baladhuri documents that often gets lost in simpler conquest stories. As Qasim moves inland, negotiated settlements become incredibly important.
So it wasn't just fighting all the way.
Not at all, according to Baladhuri. At a place called Nirun, he says the locals sought peace through their priests. A treaty was made. They agreed to provide supplies.
Priests as negotiators.
Yes. And at the Sarbiada's temple, monks offered peace terms. A governor was appointed, a tax kharaj was set. At Sadusa, same thing. Locals asked for peace, treaty granted, tax imposed. Qasim also took some local leaders, and about 4,000 people identified as jats or zut, maybe as hostages or security.
So a pattern emerges. Approach a place, local religious or community leaders negotiate, agree on terms, often involving a tax, and peace is established.
Exactly. It really complicates the idea of just rolling over everyone militarily. Now, Baladhuri does describe the big battle with Raja Dahar. Qasim's victory, quotes the war poetry.
The main military clash.
Right. But even after that, as Qasim moves up the river towards Multan, the treaties continue. Samandari community agrees to feed the troops, provide guides. Samad makes a treaty, and Aror, another major city, is taken by treaty.
And the terms of that Aror treaty were specific.
Very specific, according to Baladhuri. No killing and no entering their temple.
Wow. Explicit protection for a local temple written into the surrender agreement.
It's quite striking, and this leads directly to maybe the most significant quote attributed to Qasim in Baladhuri's whole account. He's reported to have said that the temples the bud are like the churches of the Christians and the Jews and the firehouses of the Magians.
That's huge. He's basically putting these local Sindhi temples in the same protected category as the recognized people of the book in Islamic law at the time.
It certainly suggests, in Baladhuri's telling at least, a pragmatic recognition of these sacred spaces, fitting them into an existing legal framework. After the treaty at Aror, the tax kharaj was imposed, and then a mosque was built.
And finally, Multan, the end of this initial campaign push.
Multan apparently put up a strong fight before surrendering, and Baladhuri mentions the discovery of a huge stash of gold. There's so much gold that the place got nicknamed Frontier with the House of Gold. Farj Beit Dahab.
A profitable conquest.
Seemingly so. He also describes the Great Temple at Multan as a major pilgrimage site. People came, walked around it, shaved their heads and beards rituals.
And he comments on the idol.
Yes, Baladhuri notes the idol, the sun, in the Multan temple was said by locals to resemble the prophet Job. which, as the analysis points out, is fascinating, maybe showing some local effort to connect their traditions to figures known from Abrahamic stories.
A kind of syncretism or local interpretation.
Possibly. And Baladhuri even compares the pilgrimage rituals at Multan to the Muslim Hajj.
Again, trying to understand the unfamiliar by relating it to the familiar.
It seems that way.
Yeah. Okay, so let's step back. If we pull together the key insights from looking closely at Baladhuri, what does the analysis highlight?
The source points to about 5 big things that really complicate that simple conquest story. First, the sheer prominence of Hajjaj in the narrative. This focus on the governor might perhaps reflect an Abbasid viewpoint, maybe subtly criticizing the earlier Umayyad way of doing things.
Okay.
Second, the reasons for the campaign are clearly multiple. It wasn't just the captured women incident. Baladhuri points to securing the frontier against rebels, Kharijites, Alawis, enemies of the Umayyad state, and also, importantly, state finances. Big time. Baladhuri mentions Hajjaj's massive expenditure, but also the huge wealth recouped. These figures might be, totemic, as the analysis says, but they represent very real financial pressures and motivations for the Umayyad Empire.
So security, politics, finance, a complex mix. Not just one trigger. Third point.
How Baladhuri talks about encounters with polytheists, he uses terms like Bud for temples, Sanam for idols, notes the presence of Buddhists, Semini. But what's really striking is that in his telling of the conquest phase, there's no reported anxiety about idols or idolaters, mushrikun. He doesn't seem focused on that. He even mentions idols associated with Muslim commanders without batting an eye, suggesting maybe theological condemnation wasn't the immediate priority on the ground.
That's really different from how later Islamic discourse often frames idolatry.
It is, a key nuance in this early source. Fourth, the legal treatment of non-Muslims in these early encounters. Qasim's statement, Bud, are like churches, synagogues, fire temples is huge. It shows recognition.
Treating them as legitimate sacred spaces within their framework.
Yes. And the tax, the Kharaj, seems to be primarily a land tax applied where treaties were made. Baladhuri, crucially, doesn't mention punitive taxes specifically for non-Muslims, like the jizya, as it later developed, or other discriminatory legal regimes during this initial campaign, nor does he report widespread, systematic temple desecration by Qasim's forces.
That directly contradicts the common narrative of immediate harsh imposition and destruction upon arrival.
Based on Baladhuri's account, yes, it presents a much more negotiated and pragmatic picture initially. And the fifth point is just noting there's some, albeit limited, overlap with other sources from the period.
Like inscriptions?
Yeah. Gujarati inscriptions from the 730s mention Muslim campaigns after Qasim, using terms like Tajika for Arabs alongside Turuska, Turks, and Porsika, Persians. And a copper plate from the Deccan mentions a local prince defeating Muslim armies around then too. So other sources confirm ongoing conflict in the region.
Okay, so Baladhuri, read carefully, gives us a picture of initial campaigns driven by complex motives, involving lots of negotiation and treaties, a surprisingly pragmatic approach to local religions, and not detailing the kind of immediate punitive measures or destruction often assumed.
That's a fair summary of the analysis, yeah. And the story doesn't end with Qasim's success either. What happens right after is also revealing.
Right, Qasim himself doesn't last long.
No. Baladhuri says he was arrested, thrown in prison, and killed under the next caliph, Suleiman, who hated Hajjaj and his appointees. Politics catching up with him.
And the Umayyad gains in Sindh, did they hold?
Not really, or not easily. The source analysis points out that Baladhuri describes the Muslims losing much of the territory almost immediately after Qasim was removed.
So the initial conquest was quite fragile.
Very. Baladhuri paints the following decades as pretty chaotic. Governors getting killed, cities being founded then abandoned, treaties breaking down. There were attempts to reconquer areas. A city called Mafusa was founded, supposedly because the locals had reverted from Islam.
Which suggests any initial conversions might have been pretty superficial or situational.
Could be. And the source highlights lots of internal conflict among Arab groups fighting for power and revenue in Sindh. So instead of a stable unified rule, you get the emergence of these smaller, often quite limited, city-states by the 9th, 10th centuries, Sindan, Mansura, Multan.
And they weren't totally dominant.
No, they had limited reach, constantly negotiating with bigger regional Indian powers. It's interesting, by the early 10th century, Geographers report Mansura and Multan being ruled by Shia families, descendants of Ali, though they still formally acknowledge the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad.
And these cities had Arab populations.
Yes, they became centers with significant ethnic Arab populations due to migration over the centuries. Then later, you get influence from regional Persian dynasties like the Safarids and Samanids, and the Ismaili Shia Dawa, their missionary movement spreads, linking Multan especially to the Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt by the 10th century.
So, far from a simple, lasting conquest, it's a story of ongoing instability, fragmentation, shifting political loyalties, and evolving religious dynamics over centuries.
Exactly. Baladhuri and the geographers who came after him, they depict Sind as this connected region, yes, but one made up of multiple small players, diverse populations, constantly interacting well into the second millennium.
Okay, so let's try and wrap this up. Going back to Baladhuri's early account, looking at it through this analysis, it really does complicate that simple, almost monolithic story of the 8th century conquest being the beginning and end of the story for Islam's arrival in South Asia.
Definitely. It forces us to remember the long, deep history of connections, trade, migration that existed before any armies arrived. That context is vital.
And it reveals these really important nuances inside Baladhuri's own telling, even though it's written later. The mix of reasons for the campaigns beyond just the pirates.
Yeah.
The huge role of negotiated settlements, treaties. Qasim's reported attitude towards local temples, placing them alongside churches and synagogues. And the lack, in this very early source, of detailed accounts of punitive taxes or widespread temple destruction during that initial phase.
Right. And then the whole subsequent period being much more about shaky control, fragmentation, internal conflict, rather than some smooth, easy consolidation of power.
So for you listening, processing this, understanding these details from one of our earliest available Arabic sources, it lets us see these historical events, the initial campaigns in Sind, in a much, much more complex way than just conqueror versus native.
And it prompts a bigger question, really. When we know that accounts like Baladhuri's are written, centuries later in specific political contexts shaped by particular literary traditions like Fuchsia, what does that tell us about how historical narratives themselves get constructed, how they evolve over time?
And maybe, how does focusing on the complications and nuances that are present in these earliest sources help us understand those first encounters between cultures and religions differently? Perhaps moving beyond some of the simpler and sometimes more politically loaded interpretations we hear today.
That's certainly something worth thinking about.